Today, we're going to unpack a case that began with a truly heartbreaking mystery and ended with a confession so disturbing it left an entire courtroom in tears. This is the story of the trial of Kimberly Traynor and the little girl that a whole nation first came to know simply as Baby Grace.
So, to really understand what happened to Riley, we're going to follow the exact same path the investigators did. We'll start with that grim discovery in Galveston Bay, then we'll get into the chilling confession that blew the case wide open, and we'll end up right there in the courtroom, where a jury had to make an impossible decision.
You know, this whole story doesn't begin with a person. It starts with an object, a plastic bin pulled right out of the water by a fisherman. And inside that bin was an unthinkable secret that would kick off a nationwide mystery.
Back in October of 2007, this was the question just haunting investigators. They had the body of a little girl, but absolutely no name, no family, and no clue about the pure horror that had led her to that bay.
So these were the only facts they had to go on: a plastic container, a tiny body, and just nothing else, a complete void of information. They gave her the name Baby Grace, which really just highlights how desperate they were for someone, anyone, to help them figure out who she was.
Now, the big break in the case, it wasn't going to come from Texas. It actually came from hundreds of miles away in Ohio, and it was all sparked by a single incredibly important phone call.
With pretty much no other leads, investigators released this forensic sketch. It went out all over the country. It was basically a silent plea for someone somewhere to recognize this little girl's face. And that image, it was about to change everything.
And amazingly, the plea worked. All the way over in Ohio, a grandmother named Riley Sawyers saw that sketch, and her whole world must have just stopped cold. She knew that face. It was her granddaughter, Riley. And just like that, with one phone call, Baby Grace finally had her name back, Riley Ann Sawyers.
Okay, so once Riley was identified, the spotlight turned immediately to her mother, Kimberly Traynor. And what she revealed in a videotaped police statement, well, it would eventually leave jurors openly weeping in the courtroom.
"I never meant for what happened to happen." That was the core of her 4-hour confession. She insisted over and over that she never intended for Riley to die. But the details she was about to give them would paint a horrifyingly different picture.
The whole story of how they even got to Texas is pretty wild. Traynor met her future husband, Royce Ziegler, playing the online game World of Warcraft. So she packed up herself and Riley and moved for what she claimed was a great new life. But that fantasy fell apart fast, and the breaking point was, unbelievably, a 2-year-old's manners.
And now we get to the events of July 25, 2007. Traynor called it a discipline session. But what she described to police, in her own words, was nothing short of hours of relentless torture. I mean, just look at the disconnect here. The gap between the supposed reason and the reality is just staggering. On one side, they claimed the goal was to teach a toddler to say please, but on the other, the methods they used are almost impossible to even comprehend.
Traynor walked police through this horrific sequence. She said the beating just went on, and it all ended when Ziegler threw Riley across the room. Her head smashed against the tile floor, and the autopsy would later confirm that that was the blow that caused the fatal skull fractures.
And this was the detail that just devastated the jury. Traynor told police that at some point in the middle of this assault, 2-year-old Riley looked right up at her and said, "I love you." And Traynor admitted that she just stood there and did nothing to stop it.
So after Riley was dead, the focus for Traynor and Ziegler just shifted instantly. It wasn't about discipline anymore. It was about disposal. And their every action from that point on became part of this calculated effort to hide their crime.
This timeline just shows how methodical this cover-up was. It lasted for months. They went out and bought a plastic container, put Riley's body inside, and just stored it in a shed. They even tried to bury it at one point, but when that didn't work, they eventually drove to Galveston Bay and threw the container into the water.
And get this, while Riley's body was literally hidden just feet from their home in that shed, they were telling family this complete fabrication, that she'd been taken away by Child Protective Services back in Ohio. It was all part of this elaborate attempt to control the story, an attempt Ziegler would even continue later in a suicide note, where he tried to take all the blame and say Traynor was innocent.
So all of this, from the discovery of the container, to the grandmother's call, to that awful confession, it all led directly to a courtroom in Galveston, where a jury was asked to hold Kimberly Traynor accountable for her daughter's death.
Okay, so here's where things stood legally. Both Trenner and her husband, Royce Ziegler, were charged with capital murder. But this specific trial was focused only on her. Ziegler was going to face his own jury at a later date.
For the prosecution, the argument was devastatingly simple. Prosecutor Kayla Allen basically said, look, given the sheer brutality of what they did, they had to know the result would be death. She argued this wasn't an accident, it was an inevitability.
Now, the defense tried to counter that by framing this as a tragedy, not a murder. Their argument was that Trenner never actually intended to kill Riley, but that the whole situation just spun out of control. It was discipline, they claimed, that just went way too far.
It's important to know that prosecutors were not seeking the death penalty here. So this meant that if the jury convicted Kimberly Trainor of capital murder, the mandatory sentence she was facing was life in prison, with absolutely no chance of ever getting out.
And really, this is the question at the very heart of this case. It's the question the jury had to wrestle with. When abuse gets this extreme, where does blame end and where does responsibility begin? I mean, is there a real difference between intending for a child to die and doing things where death is pretty much the only possible outcome? That's the question that hung over that courtroom. And honestly, it's one that sticks with you long after you hear the verdict.